Governance and APRM from SAIIA. Mr. Turianskyi, welcome and a very good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much for having me, Elvis.
First and foremost, can you give us an update what is happening currently in Crimea?
Look, Elvis, I think the last time we spoke was about 3 weeks ago, and that was just before the Russian invasion of Crimea took place. And already in that interview, I was saying that Ukraine is in a volatile situation, and the biggest threat is coming not from the inside, but from outside Russia. Unfortunately, that is indeed what happened, and currently what we're seeing is an annexation of Crimea. So in the past few weeks, we've had a takeover of the Crimean parliament by military forces, by Russian paratroopers, and we've seen an installation of a prime minister who at the last elections in Crimea in 2010 only achieved 4% of the popular vote. The new Crimean parliament proceeded to vote for a referendum that was organized in less than 2 weeks. And if we look at the numbers, it's allegedly over 85% of the people showing up for the referendum and over 97% voting in favor of joining Russia.
Is that correct?
But these numbers are highly disputed, Elvis. I've seen pictures on social media of ballots being pre-printed with a tick in the right place for joining Russia. Apart from that, the Crimean Tatars, which constitute a 20% minority in Crimea, have boycotted the referendum, and yet we're looking at 85% of the people showing up. I saw a blog post by an author who looked at the population in one of the cities, Simferopol, and if you look at the registered citizens in that city and the turnout for the referendum, we're looking at 123% of the population in that city showing up for the referendum. So these numbers are highly disputed. The leader of the Crimean Tatars, he says that he saw the actual numbers which were sent to the Russian security forces. And he says that according to those actual numbers, only 34% of the population turned up for the vote and not 85 like the Russian and the Crimean authorities claim. So that's the situation at the moment. We have a disputed region. Russia says that Crimea is now theirs. Syria and North Korea agree with them. But pretty much everyone else in the world, and specifically if we're looking at Africa, Nigeria has said no to it. I think the rest of the African states, due to their links with Russia, have chosen not to comment on the matter. But if we look at the Western world, Europe, the US, Australia, Japan, they all say that this has not been done in a legitimate way, not in accordance with international law, not in accordance with the Ukrainian constitution, and that Crimea is Ukrainian.
If these referendum figures are disputed, as you indicated, why is it that the international media is not getting hold of these figures?
You know what? I think the biggest issue here is the very strong state propaganda by Russia. The fact that they have an international channel like Russia Today, the fact that there's a Russian lobby in many of the Western and other states, and they're essentially winning the information war. Ukraine, unfortunately, does not have the same capabilities to inform the Western media. But, if you follow the right people on Twitter, you can find these things out. Unfortunately, knowing Ukrainian also helps in this situation, but certainly from my side, I've also been trying to tweet and translate some of these numbers and some of these statements into English, just to try to give a more balanced and more fair view of the situation.
Now, the US and the EU, they're not happy about the way President Putin has handled the Ukraine crisis. Could he have handled this better?
In terms of what
the
Putin
annexation
did?
of
Look,
Crimea?
I think that he did what he wanted to do. It was essentially a sham referendum, and very quickly, within 2 days after the referendum results were announced, Putin moved in to accept Crimea, to sign the relevant documents. The referendum was held on Sunday. Putin made his announcement on Tuesday, very reminiscent of the Soviet leaders speaking and everyone giving them a 10-minute standing ovation. And then the Russian parliament promptly proceeded to ratify the necessary agreements by that Friday.
What do you think will the impact be on Russia in terms of the recent sanctions being announced by America and the Western world?
In terms of the numbers that I'm seeing, Russia has already lost about $200 billion in its economy, and we're just talking about negative reaction of the markets. We're talking about their currency, the ruble, taking a deep dive after all these decisions and announcements are being taken. But of course, the way forwards is the major scenario on our hands. Yesterday, we've seen announcements by the EU and an announcement by the US administration, which were quite strong. But essentially, the message of these is keep Crimea and do not go anywhere else. There's 100,000 Russian troops that are conducting military drills on the borders of Ukraine in the north, south, and east. And every day they're moving closer. And I'm not just talking about troops. I'm talking about military helicopters. I'm talking about armored vehicles. I'm talking about tanks. So in my opinion, the announcements that we heard yesterday that said that the third round of sanctions is now ready against Russia. And these sanctions are not going to be against Putin's inner circle and Russian politicians. These are going to be against the Russian economy as a whole. U.S. already speaking about Europe's dependence on the imports of natural gas from Russia and saying that the U.S. is happy to provide Russia, to provide Europe with this gas in order to make sure that they are not reliant and dependent on Russian gas. So if we do see attempt to repeat the Crimean scenario in Ukraine's eastern and southern provinces, we can definitely see sanctions against the economy of Russia as a whole being taken.
Is there possible scenarios and solutions to this issue, you think?
I think it all depends on how desperate Putin is to take as much of Ukraine as possible and perhaps not even stop with Ukraine. If you look at Moldova, perhaps you can bring up a map of Ukraine and of Europe. I'm not sure if your producers would be able to do it, but I can show you exactly what some of the analysts are saying that Putin's plan is, and that's essentially to create a landlocked solution in eastern and southern Ukraine, leading into the disputed territory of Transnistria in Europe, which would obviously include Crimea as well and completely redraw the post-World War II borders that were set in Europe since 1945. And if that takes place, there's no way of knowing who's next. It could be Poland. The Baltic countries are certainly very afraid that they might be next if the Russian aggression is not going to be curbed.
Now, Ukraine has ordered its armed forces to withdraw from Crimea following the capture of the key naval base by the Russian military. Do you see this as a sign of them probably giving up or not?
Look, I think it's a case that the Russian army is outnumbering the Ukrainian army by 10-1. And Ukraine is probably also willing to give up on Crimea in order not to allow annexation to happen in its other provinces. So the troops that will be withdrawn from Crimea, all these troops will be placed along the eastern and the southern borders. So in case Russian army tries to invade from these areas, then there's an adequate army to provide a response to it. Of course, it's a very difficult situation for the Ukrainian army. Crimea is still Ukrainian, according to Ukrainians. But now that Russia has legitimized the presence of their troops in Crimea, the way they see it is now the Ukrainian forces are the occupants, and that's what their propaganda machine is working on very heavily. So you can put up a fight, but number one, you're outnumbered. Number two, these are lives of your soldiers. And number three, perhaps these soldiers could be better utilized elsewhere on the border.
Yarik, as always, thank you so much for that update.
Thank you, Elvis.
That was Yarik Turianskyi, Program Manager, Governance and APRM from the South African Institute of International Affairs, or SAIIA.